welcome to Against the Law, the myth-busting ancient history podcast. Now, sometimes when we're learning about ancient history, it's easy to fall for little white lies. We're keen to catch common misconceptions red-handed where we can. If we find a historical falsehood, you'll hear this noise. That's the sound of the Against the Law gavel smashing down on those naughty misbeliefs. I was absolutely tickled pink when I found out about today's episode, and I am delighted to be joined by Zenia, who passed her history exams with flying colours given her knowledge about the ancient Romans. Meg, who's bringing the facts about the ancient Greeks. She will talk until she's blue in the face about the epic poet Homer, so listen out for the Homeric and slightly anachronistic when we bring him up. Barney never misses a golden opportunity to share fascinating tidbits from the ancient Near East, and bringing his own colour today, we have Scott Gray. This polyglottal polymath knows just about all there is to know about the ancient world and their relationship with a particularly charming hue, but I'll tell you more about that later. Now, I'm the black sheep of the podcast today, given my lack of knowledge. I'm Flo, and I'll learn with you today all about, you guessed it, colours in the ancient world. Scott, your primary area of expertise in the ancient world of colours is blue, am I right?
That's correct, yes. In fact, it was a little bit of an obsession for a while whilst I was an undergrad. My original sort of like tongue, my native language, my prima lingua, if you will, is Scotch Gaelic. And it's a very old language. It hasn't changed a spectacular amount over the last 1,000 years. And a very interesting thing about Gaelic is that it doesn't have a word that explicitly refers to blue. In fact, the word that we use, which is garum, also means purple, which I always thought was unusual because purple is a combination of red and blue. We understand that now. So I always figured that it made sense that purple would be developed in linguistics after we had established red and blue in language. So that was always something that I was looking into. And eventually I found that there was a pattern in language in which colours generally evolved in terms of how they were spoken about as black and white. They were the primary shades. Every culture developed words for black and white. And then red, and then it would be green or yellow, and shades that sort of extended out of those. So traditionally pink and purple were seen as shades of red. And then finally, oftentimes after a very long stretch, blue would be introduced into the language, and more often than not that word was derived from the culture's word for green or black. Yeah, and I mean, for a long time, blue wasn't even part of the sort of art world in human culture. There were no cave paintings that we know of that contained the pigment blue. Blue didn't really become a part of sort of the way humans expressed themselves in the culture until lapis lazuli was mined in great quantities in Afghanistan by the Egyptians. The people of the Indus Valley had used little bits and pieces of azurite and lapis lazuli before they knew sort of what it was, and even copper, to create sort of accessories, let's say, so pendants and designs on furnaces, but it wasn't used in regular sort of fashion or to decorate big monuments until the Egyptians started mining it in immense quantities.
One of the biggest things that a human can gaze upon, i.e. the sky, is very often blue. So it seems quite strange that it's late on that people start speaking about blue.
That is a very interesting point because it raises the question, is the sky blue? Now, this is something that we've always taken for a given, but older societies didn't describe the sky as blue. The ancient Greeks described it as bronze. There are groups in continental Africa who describe the sky as being white and water being black. And in terms of the modern lexicon, we are, it seems, psychologically programmed to recognize that the sky is blue. There is a psychologist, his name is Deutscher. He raised his daughter very carefully, never describing the sky to her as blue. Now, he described the colour blue to her and introduced her to all the colours that she would need to recognise things around her. But he never described the sky as blue. And then one day, when she was a little older, and they were capable of having conversations, he asked her to describe the colour of the sky to him. And she couldn't tell him. After a long time, she decided that it was white. But then, when she started going to school, and she was being exposed to other people talking about the sky, then she started to describe it as blue.
Yeah, I find it very interesting that you can look at the sky and not see blue and not pick up a blue crayon to colour in the blue sky. Is that typically something that we're seeing across the whole of the ancient world? Zenia, what did the ancient Romans see?
So they did have a word for blue, but the thing is, especially with Latin terms for colours, they tend to just have a lot more meaning than just the colour. So the Latin for that's usually used for blue, it's called chiraleus, but it's used to refer to very deep bodies of water, and the sky is kind of perceived as also being deep. So the idea of like depth is also in this word, together with the idea of possibly blue. But it also has other associations with it. So they call blue eyes chiraleus as well. And that's kind of associated with like other, with maybe a bit of danger. Often they talk about, non-Romans or barbarians who have blue eyes. And they're kind of that's this idea of something to be a bit scared of, or to just be a little bit worried about. And that makes sense if you're thinking about very deep sea. That's quite a scary concept, especially if you're in a little wooden boat.
I feel quite edgy now because I've got dangerous eyes.
I think another interesting thing to keep in mind when we talk about like the perception of colour in the ancient world is that colour hasn't always been described in terms of its hue. For a really long time, especially the Western world, but in general, colour was recognised more by on a spectrum of light to dark, with red being the lightest and blue eventually being the darkest. So we didn't describe things as being like just green. Green was somewhere on a spectrum of light to dark. And because of that dark connotation, that's why in Rome, the colour was seen as a colour of mourning, and it was associated with barbarians, particularly with Celts by Caesar, which is very funny when you think about the fact that Gaelic doesn't have a word for blue.
Well, I was thinking that earlier. The thing I immediately thought of was like these Picts covered in woad. So when they did that, when they dyed themselves blue, what colour did they think they were dyeing themselves?
Probably purple.
Okay.
That's quite intimidating in and of itself. I mean, they could be rainbow with glitter on, and I'd still be frightened.
I'm still terrified by other Scots covered in paint, so...
Regardless of the colour. That thing about the light dark, we definitely get that in ancient Greek colours, that you get kind of glaukos, which is a colour which means lots of different things. In Homer it does again, like Zenia and Scott have been saying, it's not even really a colour, it's kind of just like shimmering or sort of silvery, or sort of more like connotations rather than a colour itself. But then later it comes to mean very much kind of like light blue, light grey, kind of olivey colour. And then you get kuaneos, which is like a dark blue or green, and it can kind of, it means like the light and dark is the key distinction.
How interesting that you should bring up Homer, because he offers a really strange sort of observation about the way ancient cultures, particularly the Greeks, talked about colour. The future sort of British Prime Minister William Gladstone back in the 1800s was an absolute fanatic when it came to Homer. He read them back to back regularly. It was one of his favourite hobbies. He treated it like a religious text, effectively. One time he went through and he decided he was going to count all the colours and how often they were mentioned. And he went through and he saw that black and white were mentioned very often, and so too was red, although to a lesser degree. I think he counted 100 approximately of black and white and then 17 of red, and then a few mentions of green and yellow, and no mentions of blue, which at the time he argued that must have meant that Homer and the rest of the Greeks were probably colorblind, like all of them collectively. That was his perception, because upon reading that, he went and read a lot of other Greek literature and found the same pattern.
So like in Homer, it is interesting because we do get words that later in Greek are associated with blue. So like both kianeos, which is kind of dark blue, and glaukos, which is light blue. He does use both of those words, but probably not with a blue meaning. So he describes clouds as kuaneos, which is probably kind of grey rather than blue. And then again, the sea is glaukos, but that probably means like shimmering rather than blue. So again, it kind of depends on how we see how they actually perceived colour, whether are they seeing multiple colours at once, if there's a colour word that means multiple colours, or are they genuinely not seeing one of the other colours.
Well, there's a pretty compelling argument to be made that you can't see a colour if you don't have a word for it. Again, there is no evidence of blue being used in the common lexicon of any language until it was commonly available in Egyptian. And there's a lot of modern research, especially neurological and neuropsychological research, that pertains to the availability of words and how you use them to describe colour.
Question there as to whether it's psychological or whether it's physiological, whether or not we had the developed cones and rods to be able to interpret blue as blue, because we think of it as a primary colour. At school, we're taught that blue is one of the primary colours, and that blue, yellow and red make up the rest of the world. So yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, to ponder about.
That's a very modern notion as well, because I might be wrong here, but I believe the Greeks had 4 primary colours that they considered were essential for painting.
Yeah, well, there's the sort of 4 colours which are associated with 4 elements in Greece, which are black, red, yellow, and white. But again, yellow and green are very linked, kind of sometimes interchangeable. That's chloros, and then obviously black and brown and red are all sort of interchangeable. So, but yeah, the 4 colour theory is what the Greeks had, rather than what we have, which is kind of often like that tricolour primary colours theory.
Well, the good news is that the Akkadian language of ancient Mesopotamia has no word for colour whatsoever.
Wow.
Surprisingly forward thinking.
There's no abstract word for colour. So to have colour out of context, you could say that something was red coloured, but you would there's just no sort of standalone word for colour. But they also had problems with blue, as you can imagine. Seems like everybody's struggling with that. The word for blue in Akkadian was just their word for lapis. So it's an interesting category of colours defined by similarity to a material, or even just being defined by the colour of that material. So their word for gold and coloured things just came from the material gold as well.
It's so interesting that they had it, but they didn't name the colour. They just named like the material.
Yeah. So the Sumerian word, because obviously it would have been the Sumerians who predate the Akkadian language and people and the later Babylonian kingdoms and empire. The Sumerian word for lapis was zargin, which means colourful stone.
That's not very helpful, really, is it?
No, it is a colourful stone.
I was just going to ask Barney if they were just magpies, because it sounds like, something that a magpie would quite like to collect, colourful stones.
Shiny.
Shiny things.
Well, you'll enjoy the other word for some of their precious metals then. The Sumerian word for silver is just white metal, and gold is yellow metal.
I'm glad we're kind of moving towards purple, because when I was looking stuff up for this episode, that seemed to be the absolutely the most difficult colour that both the Romans and the Greeks struggled with, that they really had trouble defining. I found one article that was just called "Does Purpureus mean bright?" It's just not sure how to translate it. Did you find that as well, Meg?
Yeah, definitely. Lots of purple uncertainties. But yeah, so Tyrian purple is really important, isn't it? That it's that kind of proper deep purple, very expensive, and that then we get that association between purple and royalty, or purple and authority and being in charge, which you get all the way through. So the Greek word for purple is porphyra. Which is also the fish that you get a purple dye from. And then there's a whole word, porphyrogenitos, which means born to the purple or born in the purple. And that was used in the Byzantine Empire as like an honorific title given to a child after their father becomes the emperor. If they're born after their father becomes the emperor, they're born into the purple. And it just means, they're born into their father's rule of the empire, which I think is really cool.
That's like blue-blooded, isn't it? I was thinking about the link between how we interpret colours and the sort of more sort of feeling. So we describe somebody who's new to something as being very green, or we describe certain things by certain colours. But that seems like something that's quite consistent across the ancient world, from what I'm hearing. Zenia, the colour green as a descriptor for people. You've told me a little bit about that in the past. Could you describe green as a descriptor for me?
So yeah, it's associated with life or vigor, but also like ripeness. So you get descriptions of, as you're saying, like young people as green because they're full of energy, but then also old people as green because like we would say ripe old age, they've kind of matured. So yeah, you're right. The green does get used in this kind of multi-meaning way. There's one author, Mark Bradley, who's done pretty much the most comprehensive study of colour in the Roman world. And what he does is he characterises colour words along wavelengths. So he's like, they kind of meant similar things along this kind of conceptual wavelength. But one word that gets used an awful lot for an awful lots of different things. Okay, actually, I'm not going to tell you the word. I'm going to tell you all the different things it describes. And I want you guys to see what you think the kind of consistent idea is in between all these things. Okay, so it's used to describe skin, hair, the sea, but particularly the sea when it's got the sun shining on it. Also small bodies of water, as opposed to the kind of chiraleus deep bodies of water, like little shallow pools. The underside of leaves, sand, honey, wax, corn, gold, money, plates, marble, and the bonds of marriage.
Shiny. Nice. Don't know.
That was
Yeah.
like a list of like the song that these are a few of my favorite things.
Oh, yes.
Skin and wax and
Skin and-
corn. I
Yeah.
don't know. Is it shiny? Glitter?
The word is flawless, which kind of means blonde or fair, or maybe a little bit, yeah, like that kind of when the sun hits water and it sparkles, it's this kind of sparkly or glittery.
Shimmering.
Yeah. And you know how like the underside of leaves can be a bit more yellowy than the top side, which is getting all the sunlight and making all the chlorophyll.
Speaking of chlorophyll, I wondered if Meg's Greek for green it lent its name to chlorophyll earlier.
Yes, I was about to say. So funny you should mention chlorophyll. So chloros, which is this kind of pale green, greenish yellow, but it is used of grass and also honey. So there again, we have a confusing. I wouldn't say honey and grass are the same colour, but they are in the Greek word chloros.
Well, grass might be the same colour as honey. It depends how parched the summer has been.
Very true. Yeah, very true. And I mean, again, with Homer describing the clouds as grey, he never describes the sky as blue, as we've heard. So maybe it was just rubbish weather the whole time.
Very true. Very true.
Throughout Zenia's list there, I had alabaster in mind because it has that kind of sort of shiny, translucent quality.
That's a really good point, actually, because also we use alabaster as a sort of metaphor or a descriptor for skin now, don't we?
Speaking of alabaster, there's a little bonus Egyptian tidbit in there, in that we get alabaster from the Latin word, which I think is the same. Maybe Zenia, I'm not sure, but
Alabastrum.
yeah, alabastrum. There we go. But the bast bit in the middle is thought to derive from the Egyptian cat goddess Bastet.
I knew you were going to say that. I knew it. I was going to suggest it.
Because of vessels dedicated to her.
The thing I think it's also interesting that in all those words Zenia just mentioned, like clearly they are not all literally the same color or not the same color as we would see them now, but maybe there's that sense of like a metaphor kind of running underneath, like we now use alabaster as a sort of descriptive word for skin, even though we don't mean it's literally alabaster. And there's a very cool Greek phrase which is epi oinopaponton, which means on or by, and then so that's epi, and then oinopa, which I'll get to in a minute, and then ponton, which is the sea. And oinopa is a word that no one can really translate. No one quite knows what it means. It's a descriptive word, and it's made out of oinos, which means wine, and then ops, which means like face or eye. So it's kind of like wine facing or wine-eyed. And Homer often uses it, as I just said, to describe the sea. So there's this common phrase, epi oinopa ponton. He uses it a lot in both the Iliad and the Odyssey. And different translators have come up with different ways of translating it. And the kind of original translation that was popular for a long time was wine dark, so the wine dark sea, and that's quite a famous phrase. But people have started to be like, but he's not actually saying it's dark. What does it actually mean, a wine-faced sea, a wine-eyed sea? And some people have suggested that it is kind of a metaphor, that like the sea is kind of dangerous and wine is dangerous and it's mysterious and you might get drunk on it or lost in the sea. But there is one problem with that theory, which is that Homer also uses the word oinos to describe cattle, like groups of cows. So unless we start thinking that the cows are also mysterious and alluring, it's maybe not a persuasive metaphorical description.
Have you ever looked deep into a cow's eyes?
I was going to say the exact same thing, Scott. The cow's eyes can be very alluring, dangerous. Those eyelashes will draw you in.
They're beautiful.
So thinking about what Meg mentioned about sort of poetic descriptions of colour or particular objects like the sea, I wondered if everyone else's languages have a word for rainbows and what they might be, because our English word for rainbow is obviously descriptive, right? It's a bow that appears in the sky when it rains. But the Sumerian word for rainbow is tirana, and it means sky forest, which is quite nice. Yeah, but it certainly doesn't describe the spectrum of visible light in the sky. So, unfortunately, both English and Sumerian are deficient in that regard.
So I looked into this as well, because I was like, gosh, if they're having so much trouble with like yellow, how on earth do they cope with a rainbow? And the answer is they didn't. They were like, okay, the rainbow has maybe 4 colours. I think that's what Aristotle thought, 3 or 4. And then if you're a Roman poet, you're just like, the beautiful thousands of colours of a rainbow. So they just didn't even really bother to count the different colours in a rainbow.
I think in the Western world, the general consensus was that it was 5 colours until Newton added 2, because 7 was the divine number.
In Greek, there's the goddess Iris, who's the sort of personification of the rainbow, and I think Homer uses purple, porphyrios, which we mentioned earlier, to describe the rainbow. There's 2 colours that Homer uses to describe dawn, so like, the first rays of dawn. He calls her, and again that's a sort of personified goddess, dawn, Eos. He calls her Eos Rodactylos, and Rodactylos means rosy fingered, so a rhodon is a rose and dactyl is finger, like pterodactyl or whatever. And then he also calls her Crocopeplos, sorry, that's a hard word to say, Crocopeplos, which means like saffron clothed dawn, which I think is interesting, because again, rose and saffron, they're very different colours, but you can imagine how both of those you would see as the sun rises in the morning. I think it's two very lovely epithets.
Yeah, those are 2 really beautiful ideas. I can totally see that kind of gradual change from pink to yellow as the sun rises. It's beautiful.
Yeah, and exactly that sense of like, he's describing light there. I mean, obviously there are colours in the sky, but it's really that sense of the changing light and the colours. I think that they're both really lovely words.
Interesting that you mention kind of different categories for colour. Egyptian blue as a pigment, as a actual material rather than just an abstract colour, had a word in Akkadian and in Sumerian. It was Zaginduru, which is wet lapis lazuli. So yeah, for whatever reason, there's a bit of reflection and texture applied to their colour blue in order to describe the Egyptian blue pigment, which was so famous across the ancient world.
Okay, so we've talked about colours as concepts, but when they did actually colour stuff in, I mean, we think of all these ancient Roman statues as just being white, and that's very much like an aesthetic that was decided actually in the Victorian period. But real ancient statues in ancient times would have been coloured in. They would have been painted. And that's actually the other thing that is really sad that we don't have from the ancient world. We do have all of these statues. Now a lot of the colours have faded, but they were painted. But they also did actually have paintings. So we were talking about the great statue of Zeus at Olympia, for example. Well, I think also in that century there were an awful lot of paintings, weren't there, Meg? And same in the Forum in ancient Rome. They got these very famous painters to come in and do these amazing pieces of art, which we just don't have anymore. We don't have a reference point. But for that, they must have used colours, in the way we might see them. They must have used all these different blends of colours. So yeah, colour was really prevalent in the ancient world. Nothing was white and shiny in the way we might imagine it today in museums. But yeah, it was super, super bright. And they also used precious stones for the eyes of statues. So now we see statues and they've got kind of hollows where the eyes are. Well, they would have actually put like real gemstones, coloured gemstones in there so that the eyes looked a lot more warm and alive.
Yeah, so very similar in ancient Greece. I think this is maybe an absolutely classic against the law, because we think of those statues as this kind of beautiful marble. They're all white and gleaming but also quite kind of still and calm. I don't know. Does not. We don't think of them as being kind of almost like quite gaudy, covered in colour. Archaeologists have found in Greece statues with, there'd still be a tiny bit of pigment, so the tiny bit of red pigment left on the lips or black in the hair. And the ancient world, they loved colour. They were all about colour, but we think of them as these marble statues with very little life or colour.
In a moment of perfect harmony, the same rule applies to reliefs and architecture in the ancient Near East as well. So again, the most famous examples that people might be able to visualize might be the Assyrian reliefs in the British Museum, and they would absolutely have been painted as well in red, blue, white, black. They would have been very vivid instead of just the kind of beige color that they are now.
When I went to the V&A's exhibition of Epic Iran, they did a really good job of showing how reliefs would have been painted, which they had a projector showing the relief as we know it, and then they would project over the top of it the paintwork that there were traces of. The ancients were far more colourful than we are now. Let's talk about our favourite things from today's episode. I feel like I've learnt an awful lot, and I'm very excited to go outside now and gaze at the sky and try and work out what I can actually see versus what society tells me to think the sky looks like. So, Scott, what was your favourite thing that you've learnt today?
One of my favourite things about history in general is sort of coming to understand how other people have misinterpreted history. So even though it was only a small section of the conversation, I really enjoyed talking about people's theories for why Homer was describing the sea as wine dark. I thought that was a really interesting sort of step off the path there, because in the same way that Gladstone read the Odyssey over and over and over again and came to his own conclusions about Homer and in fact the entire Greek people being collectively colorblind, I think it's really interesting to understand what people rationalize those things as before they recognize that they were probably just metaphors.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. I'm also really glad that you brought up Gladstone, because I had no idea that he had this sort of like obsession with Homer, and like that's something that I'm definitely going to go on a Google binge about later. So since you've mentioned Homer, Meg, what was your favourite thing you've learned today?
My favourite thing, I think, was we were saying, in general terms, the ancient world is a lot more colourful than we think it was. Everything would have been painted, and just that paint hasn't survived.
Yeah, I thought that was fascinating as well. And since you've mentioned Zenia, I'm going to hand over to you. What was your favourite thing that you've learned today?
My favourite thing was hearing Scott's point about these Scottish Pictish warriors who painted themselves with woad, and we think of that as blue, but they thought they might have been painting themselves purple. I think that's really cool.
I think I might do that next time I go and do a big shop to just get people out of my way. I think that's quite an intimidating thing to do. Purple or blue, I think I'm going to go for. And Barney, what was your favourite thing you've learned today?
Well, I always value having fresh perspectives on the podcast, and so I was really interested as well to hear about the Scots Gaelic word gorum, which is purple but has to be used for blue. But since Zenia just mentioned that, I would love to ask Meg to repeat the oi pop something word, because it was amazing and I just want to hear it on repeat, basically.
What, the wine dark sea?
Yes, please.
So in Greek, the phrase on the wine dark sea or by the wine dark sea is epi oinapaponton.
That's it. So my second favourite thing was Meg's Greek word epi oinapaponton. Was it 3 P's? Nopapon.
Epi oinapaponton.
Epi oinapaponton.
Yeah.
It's so good. You know the bit in Mean Girls where Damien says to Janice, "Say crack again." Every time you said it, I wanted to say epi oinapaponton again.
It is such a satisfying phrase, isn't it? And you've got the rhythm just right there as well, the epi oinapaponton. Oh,
thank you. It does. It's rhythmic, isn't it? It's quite percussive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so that was my favourite thing.
I think my favourite thing in general is just the mystery and fascination around the colour blue, and how so many civilizations sort of waited a while before they were like, oh yeah, blue. I just like that. So after this podcast, I think I'm going to go off to the beach, stare at a red wined sea, and look at a black sky and really contemplate my life and how I interpret colours.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Against the Law. If you enjoyed it, hit follow or subscribe so you'll get all our future episodes in your feed. We love hearing from you, so please get in touch with suggestions and feedback on Twitter @AgainstLaw, that's LORE, or email againstthelaw podcast@gmail.com. Bye for now.